Hello, and welcome to the Nursing Economics podcast series. This series provides extended content relating to articles published in the journal, such as author interviews and roundtable discussions. This episode is a supplement to the guest editorial, Why I Became a Nurse Activist, authored by Ms. Robin Cogan and published in the March-April 2018 issue of Nursing Economics. In this episode, Ms. Cogan speaks of her family's experience with gun violence. Upstream measures consistent with the Cure Violence framework proposed by Dr. Gary Slutkin were discussed with emphasis on the nurse's role. According to Ms. Cogan, for nurses to do their part in curing violence, they must be caring and compassionate and be in relationship with individuals, families, and communities. Ms. Cogan also emphasized the need for nurses to take a stand, speak up, and help in whatever way they can to alleviate the gun violence crisis in our country. We are pleased to present Mr. Randelle Sasa's interview with Ms. Cogan, which provides a powerful message about the impact of gun violence in our schools, how the ongoing threat weighs on kids in the United States, the traumatic effect it has when a mass school shooting hits close to home, and what nurses can do to help put a stop to it.
Welcome to this podcast of Nursing Economics, the Journal for Healthcare Leaders. I'm Randelle Sasa, Assistant Professor of Nursing at Queensborough Community College of the City University of New York. This podcast is a supplement to the March-April 2018 edition of Nursing Economics, where we had a guest editorial on the topic of gun violence and nurse activism. Joining me in this conversation is our guest, Ms. Robin Cogan. Robin is a school nurse in the Camden School District in New Jersey. She is also an adjunct professor of nursing, teaching in the school nurse certificate program of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in Camden. Robin also self-identifies as a nurse activist and has her own blog entitled The Relentless School Nurse, hosted in the website of the National Association of School Nurses. She also has a new website where you can learn more about her initiatives at www.relentlessschoolnurse.com. Welcome to the podcast, Robin.
Thank you.
So, Robin, can you briefly talk about the progression of your career in nursing?
That is such an interesting question because I sometimes refer to myself as a reluctant nurse. I did not start out my career in nursing. I was an artist. I went to my undergraduate degrees in art therapy and psychology. And when I was finishing my degree in a general hospital, on a psychiatric unit of this general hospital, a group of nursing students came through our floor because one of their peers was an inpatient resident. And so I watched the dynamics of what was happening between the nursing students and the patient and the other nurses on the floor. And I realized that I was missing a big part of information to understand the human condition. I really had a good, strong educational background in psychology, but I was missing a huge piece of the puzzle. And I had a choice. I could either go back to school. I had to continue my education, so it was either an MSW, but instead I decided to go to nursing school. That decision totally changed the course of my work. It was a little bit backwards because I already had a bachelor's degree and actually went to an ADM program. And I spent 3 more years getting my nursing degree, and it was so different than the very progressive liberal arts college that I went to. It was a wonderful, wonderful program. It was called Helene Fold School of Nursing. And it was a very intense program. I learned a lot. I really felt prepared. I don't know if I would have felt prepared to take on the enormity of what it really means to be a nurse at 22. But at 25, I felt more prepared. From there, I worked primarily in psych and substance use disorder because that was my love. You know, many nurses don't feel comfortable in that world, and that's the world that I was drawn to. So, as a psych nurse, it was a wonderful training, let's just say that, for any other kind of nursing. I spent part of my career in case management. I was occupational health nurse. I ultimately was the health service manager for Conrail, the railroad. And Conrail was taken over by another railroad, and I lost my job. We were given a severance, so I had a little breathing room, and I decided, I had children, and my kids at that time wanted to go to overnight camp. And I thought, let's see if they need a nurse at overnight camp. Little did I know that if you were breathing and you had a license, they needed to do it overnight camp. So that began my journey into overnight camp nursing, which I did actually for 10 summers. But that first summer, everyone I met was a school nurse. And they were the most wonderful group of people. Some of them are still my closest friends. We had the best bunk in camp, hardest bunk. But I thought, I have this little breather. This is, in nursing, this is why there are so many opportunities in nursing. You can move from one place to another in nursing, and there's room and there's opportunity to grow. So I decided that fall that I would return to school and get my school nurse certificate. And so I have just completed my 17th year in Camden as the school nurse. I'm kind of jumping a little bit, but that's how I ended up in school nursing.
And for those who do not have any background regarding the process of becoming a school nurse, can you speak about the process?
It's interesting because every state has different rules and regulations. I happen to be in a state, thankfully, in New Jersey, where they do require that school nurses are certified much like a teacher. Mm-hmm. And there's certain requirements you have to have. You have to have a bachelor's degree. Typically, you don't want to go into school nurse practice being a new graduate because it's really an independent practice and you are very much on your own. So you need excellent assessment skills and really a strong clinical background. But every state is different. And that's one of the challenges of school nursing. There are, when we talk about ratios and safe staffing and safety in school, there are some school nurses that I know in states like Oregon, for example, where the president of our association resides, where a school nurse, the ratio may be one school nurse to 4,000 students in 4 different buildings.
Wow.
Hours apart, many, many miles apart. Some school nurses, it's a lower ratio. So ratios are really not the best way to judge. You really need to look at workload and safe staffing. Mm-hmm. Even in New Jersey, where we have typically a school nurse in every building, you can still have one school nurse. My very first job, I was alone with 900 students, pre-K to 8th grade, in an urban district that has many, many challenges. And it was a place where at least 2 school nurses would have been ideal. And so that whole discussion of workload and who is our community, and shouldn't we be looking at who our community is to identify the needs of the community rather than looking at an arbitrary number of 1 to 750, which is the recommended number from the AAP for school nursing, especially in this day and age with what's happening between mental health issues, safety in school, children who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. We have to know your population. When you talk about population health, it's a perfect example.
So you are pretty much an ambassador of school nursing, and I don't want to scare our audience about the 1:900 ratio. So let's focus on what made you stay for 17 years?
Yeah, such a good question. I'm relentless, and I take a challenge very seriously. But I have to tell you honestly, one of the reasons I'm in Camden is because of my own personal family background, which full circle now comes to where we are today in terms of gun violence and the aftermath of mass shootings. And one of the reasons I'm in Camden is because my father is from Camden. He called it Sesame Street, the street that he lived on. His dad my grandfather was the pharmacist. They lived on a street where the insurance man was and the barber shop, and it was a really, really nice, tight-knit community. But they had a neighbor that was very mentally ill. And I don't want to equate mental illness and gun violence because that is not a fair equation. But in this case, he happened to have come back from World War II. It was 1949, and he had many, after the fact, or probably even during the fact, people knew that he had certain behaviors that he was displaying that in 1949 was not recognized as probably paranoid schizophrenia. But, afterwards they could identify these things. And one day in September, right as school was getting to start, he went on a mass killing in that Sesame Street neighborhood. And he killed my grandfather, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and 10 other people. So 13 people died. And truthfully, that is, my dad was 12 years old at the time. That is one of the reasons that I work in that city, because I felt 17 years ago that there was a healing that needed to take place. So anyway, that is one of the reasons I stay there. I also stay there because I happen to really believe in the power of community, and I know the power of relationship, and I certainly like a challenge.
For the sake of the audience who have not read Robin's editorial, it can be found in the March-April 2018 issue of Nursing Economics. In that piece, Robin talked about how deep-seated gun violence is in her family's history, which made her decide to become a nurse activist. And actually, there's a second part to your story which is really interesting. Can you share that second part with the audience, Robin?
Yeah, because actually I did not become a nurse activist until the second half of my story. I was more like wanting to heal this wound, this family wound. But on February 14th, 2018, I got a phone call from my sister, who is an art teacher in Florida. And I was at work and she was at work, so I texted her, and her name's Mary. I said, Mary, is everything okay? I'm still at work. And she said, this was her exact text, no, there's an active shooter in Carly's school and she's hiding in a closet. Now, my father survived the mass shooting in his time because he hid in a closet. And as soon as I heard those words, my heart stopped. And I said, is she texting you? Are you talking to her? So I knew that Carly was alive because my sister said, yes, I called her, of course. She's texting me. I'm talking to her. We stayed on the phone. Carly was hiding in a closet with 18 other students in her journalism class. As most of you know, 17 people were killed that day, including 2 teachers. One of them Carly knew very well. She had 2 friends that were killed. For Carly, she was not in the actual building, so she didn't hear the gunshots, But the trauma of that whole event has impacted everybody. And for my family, it opened a lot of wounds, because it doesn't take a lot when you have that kind of generational trauma to be re-traumatized. And my sister, who was standing outside, as we see, where the yellow tape is, and you see the parents waiting desperately for their children, was standing next to a mom who was not hearing back from her daughter. And my sister kept saying to me, what do I say to this mom? I'm standing with, and her name was Meadow. I'm standing with Meadow's mom, and Meadow isn't answering her. What do I say? And I'm thinking, I'm not thinking good things. And I'm thinking, tell her, maybe she dropped the phone. Tell her, maybe the battery died. But we just, she would have gotten somebody else's phone. She would have found a way to get to her mom. Yep. We found out late that night that Meadow was one of the victims. Yeah.
And this is the Parkland shooting in Florida.
Yes.
Which was on Valentine's Day. Very, very sad day. Mm-hmm. So how's Carly and the rest of the Parkland kids doing?
Yesterday was their last day of school. And yesterday was now the next shooting in Santa Fe, Texas. And between February 14th and yesterday, all of those kids have done the most incredible, outreach, outrage, activism. They have changed the conversation and the action around this issue more than any other generation, I really do believe. But they are also young, I can't even say young adults. They're still kids.
They are.
They are still kids, and they are struggling. And, you may see a certain persona on CNN and MSNBC and all these other shows that they've all been on. But you know what? They're grieving and they're traumatized and they get re-traumatized because action is just not happening fast enough. And I think, they're moving through the process. I mean, they're trying to, they got back to school maybe 3 weeks after Parkland, after the shooting. It took weeks for them to get their things back, to get their book bags and their phones. And then their school, I mean, it was inundated with media and also wonderful things like therapy dogs and, a lot of ways for these kids to, and the community to heal. The problem is that here we are a few months later, and now we have 10 more people dead, and another school shooting, and then in between every day.
Almost
every day. Almost every day in this country, people are killed through gun violence, through intentional violence. It is an epidemic.
As we speak, there's a non-zero chance that there's another shooting that may be happening. And as you said, there's another one just yesterday in spite of the really big efforts by the Parkland kids. What's interesting is that it's really easy for people to judge that these Parkland kids are trained actors. Have you heard about that?
Oh, yes. Oh, my God.
And it's a terrible thing for them to say. And here you are an actual related person to somebody who has been victimized. So, how do you feel about all of this?
So, I see it in from two parts of my thinking. From the family part, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm worried, I'm, outraged, I'm sick that my niece is going, and my sister is going, that everyone is, and their friends and their community is going through this. From my nursing lens, I am activated. I am determined, and I promise my sister and my niece that, I will do everything I can from my place in the public health arena to address this issue. I am a school nurse in the middle of probably what sometimes has been deemed one of the most dangerous cities in America. And the social determinants of health, the health inequity, the disconnection, poverty, all of those wicked problems that continue to be kicked down the road have got to be addressed because, we are perpetuating the conditions that create violence.
That is true.
Well, it is. I was reading something. I've been doing a lot of research, and one of the more hopeful sources that I found was Cure Violence. And their theory, and this Dr. Gary Slutkin, who was, I believe, the head of the World Health Organization, so he certainly knows from where he speaks, is that every other epidemic is handled by healthcare workers, except violence. It has not been seen in that category. Now, we're looking to legislators and government to legislate violence control. But really, if you look at it as the epidemic, as the contagion that it is, because it belongs in the healthcare arena. And then it belongs in the public health arena of looking at ways for prevention. We have to get to the cause of the cause. Unless we get to the cause of the cause, we find ourselves exactly where we are today in 2018 with our, 22nd shooting in this year alone. That's school shooting. That has nothing to do with everyday horror that goes on in every community. If violence is the contagion, it's also the people who witness the violence who are then have a propensity to act on that. And that's the contagion. That's why it can be treated as a public health crisis.
That is true, and there's actually literature to
Absolutely.
support that, even this quote-unquote pseudo-commando mass murderers, they pattern after those who went before them.
That's right. And now it's progressively more and more frequent.
And more sophisticated.
And that's what happens with diseases. Diseases spread that way.
Very interesting. I never thought of the problem as if it's an organic thing.
And we have to look at it as an organic thing. I really encourage people to look at cureviolence.org to see the work that is being done when you look at violence as a health issue. Violence as an epidemic disease. Characteristics of an epidemic is clustering. That's what we have. Spread and transmission. And violence exhibits all three of those things. I mean, it is clear that if we look at this from a different perspective, we're going to get different answers. And so I feel more hopeful today than I have felt recently, because there are healthcare professionals who are working from this perspective. And what I would propose, and I'm trying my best to do it on Twitter with healthcare professionals across all sectors, is let's look at violence in that way, based on the work of Gary Slutkin. It's evidence-based. It's there. He's been doing this work for decades. This actually reminds me of the ACEs study, that nobody believed Dr. Valetti at first. People thought he was a quack. And now all we talk about is ACEs and the impact. This reminds me of what's happening for Dr. Gary Slutkin. People didn't believe him at first. I can give you tons and tons of resources, but this one, I think, might make a big difference. You believe me?
But the thing is, there are some people who really don't think of the problem that way. Mm-hmm. When you go to media, you'll have all these explanations. They would even say that, why don't you blame the individual? It's the person, it's the mental illness, but it's never a systemic thing.
Mm-hmm. Today, I think, I don't know if it was the governor of Texas, it was someone in Texas legislature who actually said the problem was too many doors at the school. There were too many doors to protect. So that's reactive. They're still working in reaction. We're talking about upstream. We need to be preventative and not reactive. And so, when I hear people say things like harden the schools, have more armed guards, arm the teachers, arm the school nurse. No, schools are safe sanctuaries. They're sacred places. They are not prisons. And that's one thing that my niece Carly talks about at her school with all of the extra security now. It feels like a prison. Our backpacks have to be clear plastic. They have to be clear plastic. And so actually, this was really funny. The young men were supporting the girls because everyone's backpack now has to be clear, and they were given these clear backpacks. So the boys started putting tampons and pads in their backpack, because, young women need those things in their backpack. So they did it as a group to make a statement. This is not the answer.
So, as a nurse activist, how do we convince people who are not convinced that gun violence is a problem?
It's a very fair and great question. And I found a wonderful graphic the other day. And it reminded me of what I miss most about President Obama, which is finding common ground. And so when you are dealing with first of all, we're not going to change people's very extreme opinions. But regardless who the person in front of you that you're talking to is, I do believe we can find common ground around this issue. Because I do think that safety is a common ground.
True.
Regardless of how you get to safety, that is clearly a shared value. Wanting your children to be safe at school is a shared value, right? Not wanting to fear, wanting to be safe when you go out into the world, it is a shared value. So finding common ground is one way that we can bridge this great divide. Understanding that people's feelings about the Second Amendment and gun control and all of these things that to me are just, it's a lot of, distraction, when really what is the issue here? The issue is life and death. The issue is, let's stop violence. Let's cure violence. How we get there, we're fortunate to be in the health profession. So let's use our tools, our resources, our talent, our desire, our relentlessness, our passion, and work together rather than waiting for the governments to react and not respond.
So obviously, gun violence has a long and complex history in America. Can you offer your insights as to what you feel or what you believe is the root cause of the problem?
I know an answer is being in relationship. I think we have moved so far away of being in relationship with people that in that space of not being in relationship, things like loneliness and isolation, they surface, they percolate. People are the other. if we are really truly to be in relationship, let's talk about it from a nursing perspective, True healing doesn't happen unless you're in a relationship with your patient.
That
right?
is true.
Because there's hope. When there's hope, when there's a relationship, there's hope. Even the small, tiny bit of hope, that somebody still cares about you. And so in some of my work in Camden, I've had the privilege to work with the Camden Coalition of Healthcare Providers. They do amazing work. I urge everyone to find out more about this incredible organization that is now, they've created the National Center for Complex Health and Social Needs. And one of the most impactful things I learned from working with them, because they go out into the community really on a population health level and work with the social determinants of health that are impacting these, they call them like hot spotters, patients who are the extreme overutilizers of emergency rooms. And if you get underneath like the cause of the cause, you'll find out that they're homeless, that they're, they have a substance use disorder, and many, many reasons why they are overutilizing the emergency room. But it's really because they're looking for relationship. They're looking for connection. Just like this student in Parkland, they're almost copycats of each other. These are outliers. These are kids who don't have those connections for whatever reason. They're just not there. The connections are not, it's not the warm handoff, That kid from Parkland I guess he was expelled and then he was placed in an alternative school. And, schools don't have the safety nets in them for the most complicated and challenging students. And yes, should they? Yes, but where are the resources? When you talk about ratios for school nurse ratios, look at counselor ratios, look at school psychologist ratios. They're extreme numbers. Let me get back to the coalition, because one of the things that they have studied is that for true healing to happen, patients are looking for what they call AHR, an authentic healing relationship. And it is an actual studied, documented fact. I found it in my own community cafe work that I've done in my schools, where I talked to parents about what was working and what wasn't working in their healthcare experience. And their answer was, I want to be able to see the doctor that knows my kid. I want to be able to see the same person. I want someone who knows my history. I don't want to have to say the same story over and over again. And when I know that I can't see my doctor, I go to the emergency room because I have to talk to a stranger anyway. And I thought, wow, I don't go to the emergency room because the hours are better. Mm-hmm. I go to the emergency room because it's a stranger. And so there's a stranger in my doctor's office too. And
Very interesting.
Yeah, really, really interesting findings. So you can't do this work without being in relationship. You can't do community work without being in relationship. That's one of the things about school nursing and why I love to teach school nursing, because if my students leave our program knowing that is part of what a school nurse does, then they will bring that to their practice as much as they'll bring, heights, weights, screenings, and all the other tasks that we must do, which I think are still important. But I think what's most important is being that person in your school community that builds relationships.
Very interesting. It made me reflect because, we have all these wonderful technologies nowadays and everybody's connected. But at the same time, paradoxically, everybody seems to be more disconnected because instead of people talking to one another, everybody is using their phones and nobody is really talking. So we tend to be more isolated. That's how I feel.
Absolutely true.
So being in a relationship, having a good relationship in your family, in your school, in society in general, that is the solution, and that's what's dysfunctional
and that's
right
what's
now.
Missing, and that's what's dysfunctional. And when I look at the course of time that has happened, it's speeding up. It's happening more frequently. The contagion has spread.
How do we stop it?
Well, if we follow the model that stopped the diseases like AIDS and all the other horrible diseases that we've been able to cure, or at least stop, you stop it. I mean, I'm not going to simplify things. I don't want to make it sound like it's so simple, but it's a 3-step process. The same health strategies used to fight diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and AIDS, you interrupt the transmission. You find that angry person. I'm a school nurse. I know who's angry in my building. And I know that if I don't solve their anger and the person they're angry with, it continues, and then it moves to the community, and then the community brings it back into the school. It just happened last week, and there was a threat of gun violence in our school because of an incident that happened on a Monday that continued into the community. By Friday, parents weren't bringing kids to school, and a student threatened to bring a gun to school.
Wow.
So the contagion spread, so you interrupt the transmission, mediate the conflict. You have to have those hard conversations. You have to get in this model anyway, through Cure Violence. There's actually a new thought about training people that maybe at one time had been like community health workers, but they call them violence interrupters. And I can see this in a school community. I can see the need for this every single day. And then you reduce the highest risk, mitigation of the risk. Look at changing behaviors. Of course, that is a very complex topic, but with attention, with relationship, with hope, with check-ins, with really caring about someone, it can happen. It's not impossible. Providing treatment. The hardest one, the most challenging one, is changing community norms. But it can be done. Adding extra resource officers, hardening schools, making sure there's metal detectors everywhere. That's reactive. That's a Band-Aid for a moment. That'll get you through the day. That's not going to change your community. That's not going to change the course of events. It's not going to prevent violence.
So it really begins at the personal level, and interpersonal relationships is the cure. And then we work up into the bigger systems.
Scale it up.
Nurses may not be aware of it, but we can help in solving the gun violence crisis in our country. I'd like you to speak about nurses in general and then zoom in on school nurses, given that a quarter of all mass shootings happen in schools.
At school, yeah.
How can we help?
It's an emergency. It's an epidemic. It's a crisis. And we can help by understanding that we need to be trauma responsive. We need to create environments where our students feel not just safe, but feel understood. Be that caring person. When you look at children who are at risk for committing suicide, if you look at children who are at risk for committing violent acts, one thing that they share in common is that they're looking for a person to care about them. Be that one person. And in nursing, our compassionate, caring DNA that's in hopefully most nurses, hopefully.
I hope.
We need to supercharge that. That needs to be our greatest asset. We can be the most skilled on every computer equipment and we can write we can do all of those things really, really well. But that's not touching the patient. That's not working hands on hand. That's not eye contact with your patient. That is really being technically really super savvy, and that's great. But what about why we're really here? Compassionate care. That is especially needed in school. I think of all people that I've ever worked with, kids need the most compassion. And truthfully, so do educators. It's a pressure cooker environment. Schools are complex. They're a complex living organism, and they're changing rapidly. And so in terms of school nursing, we find ourselves right now in this crossroads of, am I okay? Am I safe? Should we get panic buttons? I mean, in New Jersey, they're talking about putting lights on top of schools and panic buttons in people's offices because this is so prevalent. But what are we doing to create those relationships? The school nurse's office is a safe place to land. But if there isn't a school nurse present, or if the school nurse has 900 students in 3 buildings, all those things, I can go on and on. We certainly need to have the research to understand what our next steps are going to be. I mean, I think there has been some research done. Clearly, there's not enough research around gun violence because of the whole Dickey Amendment and the impact of lobbying groups like the NRA. That kind of research. That reminds me of the tobacco industry. I mean, it's no different. When they've said for decades tobacco didn't kill people, tobacco didn't cause cancer, until one day, we're going to have that with gun violence. But we already know it. We know that violence begets violence begets violence. It's a contagion.
It's been 3 months. after that unfortunate event in Parkland. And actually, the Parkland kids organized this massive rally in Washington, D.C. and nationwide. There you go, another shooting just happened. Is there anything changing at all? And do you have any updates on gun violence advocacy and legislative efforts that you can share with the audience?
So the irony of what happened yesterday, there's a picture that is circulating on Twitter of the students from the Santa Fe High School holding up big signs in support of the Parkland kids. When the kids did the walkout, I think it was to commemorate Columbine, and students walked out of their school. And Santa Fe High School sent Parkland a picture of them walking out. One of the Parkland kids posted it, actually. So that the irony of that is just, I saw that and I thought, a few short weeks later, and here you are. Now it's happening in your community. And so in terms of advocacy and activism, what I am encouraged by is that I see that there are groups of healthcare professionals across all sectors, including physicians and epidemiologists and psychologists and nursing educators that are coming together. Now, at this moment, it may just be on Twitter, but I see groups of people coming together in discussion, in being activated and taking action. There's a group of physicians that have joined Moms Demand Action. Moms Demand is an outreach after Sandy Hook, Connecticut. So there's now Docs Demand Action. There's Students Demand. I started School Nurses Demand, and then we expanded it to Nurses Demand Action. We're trying to get, Moms Demand to kind of bring us in. That's really my goal. But I've been in touch with the Docs Demand. The person that runs that actually is a trauma surgeon who himself was the victim of gun violence. He was shot in the neck when he was a teenager. His friend who was shot died. He grew up and became a trauma surgeon, and he speaks now on the impact of gun violence. I met a radiologist, I think it's Heather Scher. She's a radiologist in Parkland, and she did an unbelievable essay for the Atlantic magazine about, did you read it?
I read that.
About the impact of AR-15s and what it does to the organs.
And how different the gunshot wound is as compared to a regular pistol.
Right.
It really destroys.
It pulverizes the organ, and you can't save them. And so there's people like Heather and Joseph and other healthcare professionals who are coming together and saying enough is enough. We're going to take this on as the health issue that it is, as the crisis that it is. So I'm very encouraged to see that movement. And I really encourage other nurses, please get on social media, get on Twitter, meet these people, get in touch with me. I'll show you. This is what we need to do.
So again, that website is www.relentlesscoolnurse.com.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that actually leads me to my next question, because I am sure that we will reach hundreds, if not thousands, of nurses who are very interested in joining advocacy efforts against gun violence. The thing is, we are the biggest sector in the healthcare force, 3 million people strong. So, can you offer any thoughts on how to get involved and any message for potential nurse activists out there?
There's not one way to get involved. I think it's really interesting in nursing because we're looking for the pathway, right? What's the pathway? There is not one way. I think that we need to use our voice, leverage the fact that we are the most respected, that we're considered the most ethical profession, and we have been for decades now. I mean, the 1 year we weren't was because of 2001 and firefighters were. So use your voice however you choose to use your voice. We can no longer sit back. We have to stand up, take a stand. It may be controversial. You're not going to lose your job because you are fighting for the rights, for the safety of your patients, of your family, probably of your children, of your community. Leverage the respect that we have. Write op-eds in newspapers. Do interviews. Post on Facebook, get out there on social media. Let other people know that you are a nurse, you are worried about this public health crisis, and you are going to be in action around it. You will find your people, you will find your tribe. We can turn the tide on this. There's a public health expression that you can't boil the ocean, but I do believe you can boil your part of the ocean. So if everybody boiled their part of the ocean, it would all come together.
I also believe that silence equates to complicity. So if
Consent.
we're not part of the solution, then we're part of the problem.
If we're not speaking up against it.
Any final thoughts you would like to share with our audience?
I want to thank Dr. Donna Nakaitis for giving me this opportunity. She has my greatest gratitude and one of the most professionally generous people I have ever met. And I want to thank you also for coming all the way to the Jersey Shore to interview me.
Thank you for having me.
And I really encourage other nurses or people that are listening to stand up and use your voice, use your place, use your knowledge, your talents, your skills, your passion, your advocacy. We're in a crisis and we need you.
On that note, I'd like to thank our guest, Ms. Robin Cogan, and you, our audience, for joining in. Join us again in another podcast soon. I am Randelle Sasa, and this is Nursing Economics, the journal for healthcare leaders. Have a wonderful day.
The Nursing Economics podcast series is owned and produced by Genetti Publications Incorporated. All rights reserved. No portion of this podcast may be used without written permission. Robin Cogan is a school nurse in the Camden School District in New Jersey and adjunct faculty, Rutgers University School of Nursing in Camden, New Jersey. Randelle Sasa is an assistant professor of nursing at Queensborough Community College of the City University of New York and a Ph.D. doctoral nursing candidate at the Graduate Center of the City of New York. For archived episodes of this podcast and to learn more about nursing economics, visit the journal's website at nursingeconomics.net. You can also subscribe to the Nursing Economics podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, our hosting site Spreaker, and other various podcast delivery services.